I have provided for you both electronically and hard copy, and Dylan is actually posting to our website and placing on social media so that all of our community stakeholders, parents, and others will have access to the same document. We've had some discussions over the last couple of weeks with all of you individually regarding where the state is on testing. Gathered lots of thinking from you, certainly, and included your thoughts in this update. It's a good time to give an update, and I've also had conversation with folks from Tallahassee. There's another conference call in the morning, by the way, with DOE and superintendents. And so we've had discussions and, quite frankly, had some frustration at some limited or conflicting information that was being provided. And in that void, and I shared the same with the commissioner, in that void we have lots of announcements and decisions being made, and sometimes there are misunderstandings among districts and within our schools because of some of those announcements. So it's a good time for us to codify. I actually promised one of you that I would have maybe a half page or so. This is a 3-page document. I apologize. But I figure if we're going to try to at least have a good history of what has gone on, it's an important point to bring that back to focus. So what I provided for you is that actual memorandum from me. Hope that most of you will post it to your web pages as well. We are publishing it through social media and to our web page and to principals so that they can share it with teachers. It's a good history of where we are, and I apologize for the length of the document. You're looking like you can't find it. There was one at each. Okay. Okay. And then you have the electronic version as well, so you can post it or forward it as you see fit. So let me just review it briefly. I won't read it to you, but April 9th, as you're well aware, is when the bill CSHB 7069 was signed by the governor. It had a few changes to our accountability and evaluation system. I've listed 3 of them. One is allowing districts more flexibility in progress monitoring and decisions concerning remediation. Another is elimination, at least on the assessment-related requirements for our assessments. And thirdly, reducing the required minimum percentage of student learning growth scores on a teacher summative evaluation from 50 to 33%. I have at the very end of the memorandum, because I didn't want you to think I had forgotten, that bill also did make provisions for a later start date. Just so I can set that aside and get it out of the way, our calendar committee did meet, and they agreed that they would make no recommendation to the board to change the start date for this year. They will potentially have additional discussions and want to take advantage of that for next year. But that is a part of the same actual bill that was signed into law. So let me go through, here are the challenges. As we've had these discussions, there's still some unanswered questions, such as, are districts permitted to base evaluations on a select number of students instructed by a teacher rather than all students instructed by a teacher? Very simple question, we believe, still remains unanswered. Number 2, are districts permitted to use the results of reading and or mathematics assessments to evaluate teachers, even if the teacher is not instructing a reading or mathematics course? Again, no clear answer yet. Thirdly, are there sanctions that will negatively impact the district? Pending those previous 2 questions. Still awaiting communication. We are told by DOE that at the May 6th FOIL meeting, and FOIL, in case folks are wondering, stands for Florida Organization of Instructional Leaders. At the May 6th meeting of FOIL, there will be DOE staff there to bring some clarity to this new legislation. They do qualify, however, and say we are still studying the bill. We cannot assure you that we will bring clarity around or conclusive information around all of the issues, but they will be in attendance. So in light of that lack of some clear direction, let me review the testing status here in OCPS and share how we want to proceed at this time. testing, by the way, is currently going on. The timing of such announcements is certainly not optimal because we are already in the testing windows. As we all know, testing also, not only is it currently taking place, in January we administered hundreds of EOCs for those students who were in single semester courses. Majority of our courses are year-long. If you were in a single semester course, you took an EOC in January. Hundreds of those were administered. We are hearing and reading about several districts with a variety of actions being taken at this point, largely due to that void from DOE. I want to say clearly, in fairness to the Department of Education, they are under the same bizarre time constraints that districts are under. Very little time to interpret and give direction as well. So let's review where OCPS is. What actions have we taken to date? Because I think sometimes perhaps we are not as apt to provide as much PR behind our decisions, but I want everyone to understand this board has taken significant action to date, including decreasing by 27 the number of assessments and benchmarks that we had back in October. That's 27. And then on March 19th, prior to legislation even being signed, March 19th, we eliminated 42 tests. That was where we put out information regarding all of our elementary EOCs, K through 4th. If you'll remember, note it below, that is cut and paste directly from that previous communication. And the ESE versions of tests as well. 42 tests were eliminated. I think people tend to forget this board has taken aggressive action. Those 42 were prior to any signed legislation. So we and I have the 3 bullets there for you just as a reminder. That's a communication that went out previously. Here's where we stand now. Announcements from some districts are actually indicating that they are doing what you already did back before spring break, eliminating some of those EOCs at the elementary level. We are aware that most of those districts are, however, still administering some kind of nationally purchased version or other version for their English language arts and their math in the elementary grades. In fact, one large district, when their information came out, had already administered the Stanford 10. We use ICTBS, but they're using the Stanford 10. They had already administered that for kindergarten through 2nd grade students for math and for reading. We're also aware that when it comes to art, music, and PE at the elementary level, some districts are reverting to giving those teachers the school-wide reading or math score. That is why we posed that question to DOE. Is it appropriate to give school-wide scores even if that teacher does not actually instruct reading? We think that is not the intent, but it may be considered allowable. It may be considered allowable. At the secondary level, some districts seem to also be considering using reading data, but only for the specific students. And pardon me for giving you an example, because I used this early with another board member. So if I am a dance teacher, the roster of students that I am teaching for dance, in some instances, some districts may think it is allowable to use that same roster and just pull those students' reading scores. If they are in my class for some other course, that I can pull their reading scores, and that would, in essence, give me assessment data as an individual teacher. And in some instances, they are reverting back to having teachers create or use their own exams if no state exam is available. We are also well aware that some districts may not have had all of their EOCs created to meet the deadlines required nonetheless. And then other districts, of course, are planning to proceed with their EOCs as planned at this point. So let's get a focus about how OCPS might proceed. Number one, and I appreciate Board Member Colbert actually provided you with copies of our resolution on testing, so you see that we are parallel to what this board has agreed to. Number one, we do support accountability. Assessment of student learning is appropriate. It helps inform instruction, and it provides some quality assurance in large urban districts. A common assessment does that you are having similar information shared with your students across schools and across the district. It helps direct our professional development. It certainly is an area that we were commended for as we were reviewed for the Broad Prize. Common assessment is a healthy practice for a district our size and an urban district with mobility. Secondly, Race to the Top funds were used, and we assembled some of our best teachers to help create the test items based on the standards and the course content. Just to give you an indication, only 200 or so of our 800 tests had state item banks available for us. In those cases, teachers still participated in creating the blueprints or the assessment outlines for the exams. And all of the assessments were written with team members and a lead nominated by principals for expertise in their content areas. All teachers participating in the writing also went through specific training on constructing good items and assessments. This is an important point. Blueprints, we negotiated with our union. Blueprints, or the assessment outlines for every test, were provided to all teachers in August. While the development of the items were held secure, everyone had an outline of the actual contents that would be included on the test. That was negotiated, required through our union. Thirdly, in OCPS, we replaced final exams with those tests. In other words, no teacher would be giving their own prepared final examinations because EOCs replaced final exams. I mentioned to you earlier, some districts were going to revert back to final exams. I don't want anyone to think we're doing final exams and EOCs. We replaced final exams with the EOCs. And our AP, IB, ACE, etc., students who have those kinds of tests are essentially not also taking an EOC. Number 4, in some secondary schools, final examinations in the past have gone up to 120 minutes, meaning they took 2 class periods in some instances to complete them. Our final exams are 80 minutes at the high school and middle school. 80 minutes at the middle school and 100 minutes at the high school. So, as mentioned before, over 100 EOCs administered. Teachers and schools set those cut scores. Students received A, B, or C. Calculation of 20% for their final exam, and those scales basically did no harm. In fact, we are told by our accountability team that no student dropped to an F due to an EOC grade at the semester, EOC exam at the semester break. So we purposely calibrate them, and then the schools were able to calibrate very generously for our students. Reverting to the use, item 6 on page 3, reverting to the use of reading or math scores for students in special areas or electives. Reverting to the use of reading or math scores of students for a special area or elective teacher's evaluation, while potentially allowable, and I say potentially because we may get clarification on May 5th. They know we are saying you're going to have to be consistent. You got to say it so everyone is doing the same thing across the district. While it is allowable, may be allowable, we're concerned about whether or not it's equitable for our teachers. Because we believe teachers should be evaluated not only just for the students that they instruct, but also for the actual subject matter that they are instructing. Allow me an example once again. If I am an art teacher in an elementary school and I have done a dynamic job of conveying my art curriculum to my students, that's really what I want to be evaluated on. If my school happens to be a school with lower reading scores, to give me those outcomes for my evaluation does not seem equitable, does not seem fair. Same would be true if I happen to be a music teacher at a school and I'm not actually covering my curriculum well. I may not be doing such a bang-up job, but because my students are performing high school-wide in reading, I would get that higher assessment as well. It seems inequitable that you would make those divisions among our teachers. So we would like to see that the standards, that our evaluation is not only for the students that you teach, but also for your subject matter. Number 7, our MOU with CTA holds the student learning rating for all of our teachers at the effective level. That means we, in essence, have held our teachers harmless for the 2 years of our implementation. The state may not have been happy with that initially, but they agreed. Our plan was approved that our teachers are in the quote-unquote held harmless. And I want to talk about how we have tried to do the same for students in just a moment. So where do we go moving forward? How do we try to at least be thoughtful as well as strategic rather than reactive, because some reaction may have to be undone and redone, as we've seen previously with the state. Here's what we think. We think OCPS should consider exactly what we asked the state to do in their testing. And quite frankly, my prediction at this point, because of all of the issues that have arisen, I'm still hopeful that the state will have to revert to considering this first year of their administration of the new test to be baseline. That's what we want to do here in OCPS, to make those baseline. Secondly, we really want to move away from the notion of EOCs. It's almost a bad word. I do think we can have common final exams. Our teachers are giving final exams anyway. We can have some common final exams for our students, and no double testing, no double jeopardy for our students. At the same time, I think we have to reinforce that that information, those secure pieces of information, can be used to inform instruction and to direct our professional development, not only for the new standards, but for other curriculum areas. We can help direct our professional development and inform our instruction going forward. I think we have to remind teachers as well that they are, by union MOU, held harmless for the first 2 years. More importantly, I think this baseline year we can also use as an opportunity for feedback, both from teachers on those blueprints, feedback from students on actually taking the exams, and further information for our instruction. I want to stress again, all of the blueprints were provided by union agreement. The outline of what was going to be on the test were provided, but it's an opportunity for us. And I should mention, our testing and accountability department keeps a log. When they get a call from someone who says here was a concern on a test, or a student came up and said one of the questions was incomplete, then they log that information and will continue to gather. It will certainly remind teachers and schools that they need to call in if they have any of those concerns. Here's what I want to say about student outcomes, because I want to get a similar cushion and protection for our students during baseline development of the final exams as well. And I want to move toward saying they're just common final exams. We are very interested in our initial look shows that we have not had negative impact, significant impact at that 20% mark. I think we have to look retrospectively to make sure we are not impacting students for initial implementation. If we want baseline, if we want to gather intel and even improve those secure tests, then I think we need to look to make sure we negate any negative impact on our students. As I said, teachers and schools were very generous setting those cut scores. They gave out mostly A's, B's, and C's for those final exams. No failures based on those final exams, but we need to look at that retroactively and going forward to make sure we're cushioning our students from any negative impact during development and baseline. Lastly, and this is information that folks will be certainly interested in, I've asked staff to review and to continue to review, do we have any other potential tests that we can eliminate while we're still trying to have some consistency for our teacher needs and the evaluation system. And they've initially identified about 15 additional exams that we believe can be eliminated. They will continue to go through that information. I have to tell you, any school that is a TIF grant school cannot essentially have any of their EOCs eliminated. They are required to administer their EOCs. We also intend to decrease, I'm almost done, I promise. We also intend to decrease our formative assessments, those benchmark assessments, because we are given that flexibility. We can eliminate some of those going forward as well. We will need to evaluate the board rules. They are coming to town. Folks need to be present and listening and giving input when they come to town for input on state board rules. They are required by statute by August 1st to have some guidelines in place. And then eventually the school board is supposed to take up policy, once all the dust settles, policy around evaluation and assessment. We will look forward to the FOIL conference and any additional communication that we get from the state. We will certainly tune in to the conference call tomorrow morning for any additional guideline or direction from the state. But this is where I believe we can at least, with some confidence, at least plant our feet today. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jenkins. And did I hear you correctly? Is the state board coming to hold a meeting? I missed it.
The right terminology. Come down, Dr. McKelvey. Give them the date and the right terminology.
On May 13th, there's been a notice of rulemaking on the two rules that Dr. Jenkins mentioned have to be heard by the State Board of Education, and rules have to be adopted by August 1st. One is on the uniform submission, evaluation, and monitoring of evaluation plans for both instructional and administrative employees. And the other is on a uniform set of cut scores that districts have to use for the statewide value-added model. So for teachers who are teaching statewide courses, there are going to be one set of cut scores that will be used for all districts. Those are both going to be in 3 sets. They do rulemaking sessions across the state. So they try to go to one place in South Florida, one place in Central Florida, one place in North Florida. They're going to be coming to Central Florida on May 13th at 9 o'clock in the morning, and that'll be in the boardroom. When we have the rule text is not available at this time. When the rule text is available, we'll make sure to provide it to a superintendent with the analysis.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McGill, can you put that on our calendars, and just so we all make that if possible? All right. Thank you for that explanation and recommendation, Dr. Jenkins. Ms. Cobert.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Most of you know I've been working on this a lot. The governor signed this piece of legislation only 2 weeks ago. And I want to make a point that it took 8 to 10 years for the state to get us to this point. And we've been handed this to do a lot of corrective action, and it's only been 2 weeks. It's important to me, I've said this at this board table many times, that we are thoughtful and purposeful when we make decisions, that we don't take knee-jerk reactions. The last couple of days, I've been going through all of the other counties that have come out and made public announcements about what they're doing. It's all over the board. Some, in fact, the majority of the counties, 67 counties, are taking no action and proceeding with what they have already in place. What was interesting to me is that many of the counties who came out and said, we're eliminating all end-of-course exams. That was an announcement, but I wanted to know what their plan was behind it, because you can't make an announcement without a plan. Many of them are still using final exams, so they're ending end-of-course exams, but they're still requiring final exams, whether those are county-generated or teacher-generated, they're still requiring the final exams. Some of them are going back and reverting to using student reading scores in teacher evaluations. So, and I'm not really okay with that, because that's something that we actually had said we thought was not right, that it was unethical to use. If you're a history teacher or you are an art teacher, that we're going to use reading scores, whether they're school-wide reading scores or your own students' reading scores. I'm not okay with that. So we have to figure out some way. So then, you know, and just the elimination of testing is not really the way to go. I mean, testing has a purpose. And what we have said all along is that testing's not the issue. It's the high stakes nature of testing that we want to get rid of. We want to go back to testing being evaluative, to inform instruction, to be a good device that we use for our students. In fact, there was a letter from a student in the Orlando Sentinel, I think it was just yesterday, and the student said, I'm in favor of taking final exams. Final exams aren't punishments for students. The final exam includes everything you've learned throughout the semester on one test, and this is important. But the issue is how we use it. So went back to our board's resolution, which I gave you all a copy of, and I thought whatever we do, it needs to be in line with what we ask the state to do or the state not to do. So in that resolution, it talks about, when we talk about what we want out of an accountability and testing system, we want it not to be high stakes. We wanted whatever we use the first couple of years, and we said 1 year, but I would venture to say we would really like it to be the first couple of years for these tests to be field tested so that we make sure they're doing what they say they do, that they're aligned with the curriculum, that our testing, what is the purpose? That it should be to inform instruction, and it should be for quality assurance to make sure our kids are learning what they should be learning. We also found it very important, and this is in here, that we hold harmless. It was important to hold teachers harmless, which we have already found a way to do, and to hold students harmless with testing. And finally, to minimize as much as possible the number of tests that our students take. So then we have the memo from superintendent today, and we did talk about this a lot. Couple of comments. I want to reiterate, many of these other districts who have announced that they're eliminating end of course exams are going back to using reading scores. I am not okay with that. We need to find a way to evaluate students and teachers on the course material they're actually learning and that they're actually teaching. As far as our final exams, I think we need to discuss if this is going to be, let's say, a field test year and a benchmark year. I'm sorry, is my time up? Okay. All right. We need to talk about how much they're going to count for students if it's going to be a field test year. It's very important that we give teachers a say. So if we're using common final exams, it'll be very important during this year or 2 year process to give teachers a mechanism to give feedback on these tests. So they're part of our own teachers have been a part of developing these tests, but it's an unknown for most of the teachers out there. There needs to be a very specific mechanism for teachers to provide feedback after this year and next so that we make sure we're getting it right and that we're all doing it together so our teachers have buy-in. I think another important thing, we are now allowed to use proctors more. I think we need to make sure that we're doing that as much as possible, where we're not pulling our actual teachers out to proctor the state EOCs or the FSAs. I think that's important. I want to commend the superintendent. Some of what these other districts are doing now in their announcements are what we did in March. That we went out on a limb and we were leaders because of the amount of tests that we eliminated on the elementary level. But now it's important to really look and scrutinize at the secondary level. So let's see, what else do I have? The other thing is that when it comes to the FSA, one of the things we will be doing as we go forward is looking at the validity of that test. And so as we look at the validity of that test, we also need to come up with a plan. So if it's looking like it's not valid, and we've had so many problems with that test, I'm extraordinarily unhappy with the state and how that test has gone down. We need to look at what do we ask for? Why can't we use nationally recognized norm referenced tests like the ACT, the SAT, the Stanford 10, the Iowa, the PSAT? Why can't we use those? And that's another issue as we go forward. And we continue to develop this plan because I think this is in flux right now. I think what you have here is a great start, but we as a district and as a board need to continue over the next couple of months revising the plan and continuing to advocate on a state level for a plan that works for all of us. And you also said on here that you have 15 exams that can be eliminated now. You're also decreasing benchmarks next year, and you may recommend additional eliminations. I think we make that a priority as far as the number of tests that we eliminate. And I think with these issues, we're going to be in line with what we said our values as far as our resolution. But I think the one thing we really do need to talk about is the amount that the common final exams will count for our students, because as you mentioned, many students already took a final or an EOC in January. If we make that count for 10% this year, or not at all, and make it a pure field test benchmark year, then what happens to those students who already took it in January? We need to go back and look at whether or not that's equitable, or can we, because my number one thing is holding our students harmless. They've been through enough with all this testing and all the changes with testing and the amount of testing, and we're trying to clean this up. So how do we hold our students harmless and make sure that the testing that we go forward with is only for the right purpose? How much is it going to count this year? I think it really does need to be a field testing year, because that's what we were asking from the state. But what do we also do retroactively with those students who took those tests in the first semester? And I would also very much encourage our wonderful parent advocates to come back and participate in that May 13th meeting, because so much of what we have is a result of state mandates, and we need to continue to advocate on that level. So the flexibility that we have, we're going to use to hold students harmless, to reduce the number of tests, but we need a lot more clarity from the Board of Education, and we're not getting it. I know that superintendent has asked for clarity, and we are not getting it. So we need to continue to advocate at that level as well. So I know I've covered a lot of things, and I'm all over the place. But for me, those are the priorities: holding students harmless, making this a field testing year, advocating for more flexibility on the state level, and remembering that some of this we did do, all of the elementary level we did do. And we need to look at that secondary and what we're going to do with those common final exams this year.
Thank you, Ms. Gobert. Mrs. Robinson.
Thank you, Ms. Cobert, for always being so, I mean, you just are all encompassing. I love it. And I agree with everything that Ms. Cobert has said. And I thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for bringing this to us tonight and having it be a place where we can start this conversation and having and suggesting it be a baseline this year and next. And I have some questions. I had tons of questions. I do have tons of questions. Some of them were answered. We've been getting emails, not many, which has been amazing. I have been getting emails, and I've been going back and forth pretty in depth with several of the people, and it's been really wonderful. The dialogue's been great. But my main concern in reading this was to one of Ms. Cobert's points: how will we hold the students harmless, and how can we, during this baseline time this year, how can we, if we decide to adjust the 20% for middle school and high school down to 10 or 0, whichever, how can we go back and potentially retroactively, the year's not over yet, potentially retroactively change the students that have already taken them. I mean, my son took 2 in January. He survived. It didn't kill us. But anyway, so before the end of the school year and those grades are fine, I hope we can come up with a plan of action and figure that out. Some questions that I keep having a lot of conversation with a good friend of mine about the elementary. It seems to me most people are more concerned about the elementary common final idea than they are middle school and high school. Because middle school and high school, it's been more common to have a final, but elementary, it's not. And in particular, they seem very concerned about the PE, music and art, mostly music and art. You know, PE most schools, you see your PE teacher every day. But in music and art, you don't see them every day necessarily. And in some of our larger schools, you don't see them often at all. Has a teacher even had enough time to get the standards taught this year? So that's where people are concerned. And then the Iowa, I know that's our plan, but there's some confusion about ITBS versus Iowa. Is it the same thing? Isn't it the same thing? I've been seeing some emails go back and forth about that. the schools are, I'm not sure the schools really know which it is. I guess we'll figure that out when we do it here in a few weeks. But where are we going to set those proficiency scores for those, for the elementary in particular, for the teachers' evaluations? Does the Iowa/ITBS, do they have a proficiency score already built in? Do we come up with that? Do we have to negotiate that with our union? I mean, there's just so many questions for me surrounding the Iowa and surrounding the end of course finals for the elementary specials. Several of the questions that I had that came to me from teachers, and these were middle school teachers, and I think middle school teachers just, I guess in high school, I haven't had a single thing from a high school teacher. They're used to giving finals. It's just the way it is. I mean, we all had finals. Finals are finals. These just had the name end of course, which made them appear different. And the difference in them, and we've discussed this before, the difference in the finals all of us took versus these finals is they aren't teacher created, they're district created. And that's why they're called common finals. That's why we're going to call them common finals. But that is the mystery around it. That's what has people nervous. But the middle school teachers are the ones I'm hearing about that are really nervous because it isn't as common necessarily in middle school to have finals. So it's something new for them. They're very nervous. And several of them were concerned just because it's new about the validity of these district-created finals. They'd heard stories about, one person made the entire final. I know her. She was a teacher at such and such, and I've heard that she made it by herself. And I know I asked you about that, Dr. Jenkins, but if you could address that they're not, it's not one person sitting in a room creating these district-created finals. There's a review process, and there are more than one person. But we have so many courses that might only impact a small number of students. So I guess it is kind of different. You can't bring in 20 experts when there aren't really 20 experts on that one small thing. So those are some of the concerns. And then in one, some of the conversation I've had with one person very in depth is more around not necessarily the details of all of this, but just the atmosphere that surrounds this high stakes testing that's out there. The FSA, the state required end of course exams, and now our common finals. The atmosphere that's out in the schools, and I've tried to explain this to them. We all go to our schools. I've got the 26 schools. I go on their campuses, and it's interesting to me how different schools, the atmosphere is totally different. Some schools, it's very laid back. I think it's principal driven. Is the principal laid back about it? Do they feel like a team? Do they all feel like they're working together on this? Or is the principal totally freaked out and it's going down to the teachers, therefore to the students? So one person used the term, and I'm pretty sure, Dr. Jenkins, that you were copied on this email, that data meetings are seen as bloodbaths, and the stress and the anxiety that surrounds these, the pressure coming from the top down is so severe. And I just want us to I don't know how real that is. I'm not in those data meetings. I don't know. I wonder how we can, because we have to implement these tests, we have to administer them by law. What can we do? What's the part we can play as a district to make it, my goal for all of this, wouldn't it just be lovely for all of us if at the end of the school year you just gave your test and you were done, and don't wrap the whole year around the test? I mean, isn't that the goal? In that you have standards, you teach the standards, you teach them however the teacher feels like teaching the standards, and then the teacher gets evaluated on how well her students did on the test. I mean, that's the goal of all of this. So how can we as a district hold to that? I mean, we even have it in our accountability statement. Our resolution. What did you say? Our Bible. But I mean, it talks about the appropriateness. I can't find it now but the for the students, that being age appropriate exams, and And I think some of it is just how can we relieve some of the stress everyone's feeling, because we have to administer these tests. So that's a conversation. I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure you know the answer. But so I would love for you to investigate the bloodbaths, and if it's really happening, I don't know. So anyway, I've enjoyed the conversation with the people I've talked to this week, because it is good to hear from different perspectives. You know, I'm still a mom, and I still do have a student taking some of these, but it is different. And I think the elementary piece is what has a lot of people extremely nervous. So anyway, thank you very much for coming up with a plan. And I agree it's going to have to be fluid. And I agree with you that we're going to have to wait and see what the DOE says. So thank you.
Dr. Jenkins, I'm going to go to you to address those and hand the gavel temporarily to Ms. Flynn.
Okay. So just a couple of things, Ms. Robinson. I think, let me talk about your last item first, around the data meetings and the feeling of pressure there. That will be eliminated because the state, under this new statute, has removed or given us flexibility around what we call progress monitoring. So progress monitoring was required if you got levels 1s and 2s, which every school has some level 1 and 2s. Progress monitoring is now being backed down on the requirements, and so there won't be the need or the existence of as many formative assessments as we've had in the past. The benchmark testing will be significantly decreased, which means, in essence, but I want you to know that in some of our schools where we know we've got a struggling population, they live by that monitoring. They've got to be able to track their students. But there is no longer a requirement that we have to do it in all of our schools. So I think you'll see a significant decrease in benchmark and formative assessments, which means the data meetings also go away. That does mean, in essence, that teachers are just responsible for covering those standards. And at the end of the year, whether you've been given, you can use your own assessments to determine whether or not the students are learning. And then at the end of the year, you have the actual accountability measure. So once the formative and benchmark testing is narrowed to a smaller number, the data meetings will be narrowed as well. It's an important point. Secondly, and I'm going to let Brandon speak to the Iowa test as well as test item creation in a moment. Let me speak to art, music, and PE in particular. Those concerns, or even elementary schools, those concerns about validity, that's why we have to remind folks we are looking at baseline years. For 2 years, we've negotiated there is no impact on teachers. And so some things we will have to grow or get better at. For art, music, and PE, we've tried to condense our scheduling options. You saw this in the board update. Tried to consolidate scheduling. Large districts normally do this rather than having 183 different schedules at the elementary level. We've tried to help them build into templates so that art, music, and PE teachers are getting consistent instructional time, even if it's a larger school. That's something we've worked on quite adamantly in the last few weeks. And so hopefully by the time we look at schedules for next year, an art teacher at a large school will have similar access to her students as an art teacher in a smaller school. So that we're working on as well. Dr. McKelvey, if you would speak to the Iowa test and the test item creation. I mentioned this to Ms. Robinson earlier. Teachers are not actually sitting down and creating tests. They are helping to develop test items. And then we have staff that work with them and actually pull from those test items to create the actual test. So start there, Dr. McKelvey, and then go on to the Iowa test.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. You're absolutely right, Board Member Robinson, when you're talking about the test items. We have to use the teachers who are available, who teach the course and have expertise in the course. In some cases, there may be hundreds of teachers who teach a particular course code. In some cases, there is only one teacher who teaches it. In some cases, there's only one teacher who teaches it, and there's not even anyone else in the district who has experience teaching the course. In some cases, may not even have experience speaking the language, at least to the particular level you need to write the assessment with. So it was important to us that we tried to use as good security and as good process as possible. So let's say, and this is just an example, that we're doing a test in, I'm going to try to think of a language we're not giving because I don't want to call out a teacher or anything. So let's say we're doing a language. Do we have a Greek assessment? Okay, Serbo-Croatian. Thank you, Frank. So let's say we're doing a Serbo-Croatian assessment, right? Where we only have one teacher in the district who has that. They wouldn't be on an island, though. All the other teachers who are doing foreign language assessments would have been brought into the session with them. Maybe teachers that were teaching similar foreign languages be in that. And then we would have also had our foreign language curriculum person who is there to help them and provide some guidance as well. In an ideal world, you want that PLC kind of environment, right? Where you'll be able to help each other, look at each other's items and do like that. So we had to be somewhat flexible with the type of review that we had. And on the other side, you could imagine with Serbo-Croatian as well, a little bit difficult for our personnel to provide the same support in examining the items as you might for another assessment. But then we may do and try to find someone else or find someone who's able to edit pieces of it. So we did have to have a scale of support that depended on what the assessment was and how many people were available to write it. But we made sure that there was a consistent standard of support that we were able to provide to everything. And as Dr. Jenkins said, we relied very heavily on the work of our teachers because for about 3/4 of the assessments, there weren't even items to start off as a base from the state. So it really had to be that work. So they had to do a tremendous amount of the lifting as well because there just wasn't that base that was provided in those courses. So I hope that helps on the first question. So the Iowa assessments, I know I've tried to answer some questions on this as well. I know there were questions this weekend as well. One of the questions that I think has been most confusing is there was a name and content change to what used to be the Iowa Test of Basic Skills and is now called the Iowa Assessments. So when we change our assessment, and a great example is when we went from FCAT 1.0 to 2.0, we changed the standards and then we kind of just tweaked the name from 1.0 to 2.0. We still kind of called it the FCAT. Iowa Test of Basic Skills did receive a content change. It also received a name change. See, the Iowa Assessments. So it is a different assessment, but it is the same in the sense that it's still a nationally norm reference assessment that's made by kind of a very reputable assessment group that's Riverside and it's close to the University of Iowa. We also been receiving a lot of detailed questions about elements of the assessment, so reliability statistics, validity statistics, other information like that. We've attempted to provide anything that we can find that's available by the test company. Test companies differ a little bit in what information they make available. We're a public school district, so whenever we go out for an assessment, it goes through an RFP process. We have to choose from the companies that provide that. Different companies provide different things for their assessments. We really appreciate the questions from parents that we've received about, do you know this exactly? Do you know this exactly? Where are these specific statistics? Where could we find this information? We've had to go to find some of these things, and some of these things we can find, and some of these things just aren't publicly available. Certainly not a reason to stop asking, either from our parents or from the board members. Whenever there's a question that we can't answer about an assessment, and that absolutely happens, not just because it's a complex area, but because we're dealing with proprietary products in many ways as well. We'll always do what we can to answer that. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be available, but we're always going to do our best to make sure we go to the limits of what we can get from the testing companies.
Dr. McElvey, would you clarify as well, the Iowa test is what we've used for third grade retention retesting as well? Just say a word about that.
Sure. We have a history of using either Iowa Test of Basic Skills or Iowa assessments for years in the district. We've been using it for the Teacher Incentive Fund, so we've been using it for our TIF schools for a while. We've also been using it, as Superintendent Jenkins has mentioned, for good cause. So for grade 3 students who don't meet the requirement to receive a level 2 or higher on the assessment in order to be promoted automatically to the next grade, you're allowed to receive a certain score on a nationally norm reference test to then receive promotion through a good cause exemption. For the school district, again, through the RFP process, the Iowa assessment is the assessment that we're currently using for that. So it has a history of being used in the district as well. And our schools have at least some experience with the interpretation of the assessment.
Do these have proficiency rates already built in, like a score of pass, fail, or something for the purposes of evaluating the teacher?
So when we usually talk about passing or failing, we're talking about criterion reference tests, right? We're talking about an assessment where student scores may range, but we go out of our way to say, and this is the border of a level 1 and 2, and this is a border of a level 2 and 3. The Iowa assessment is a norm referenced assessment. So that's why you hear things expressed in percentiles. You did better than 70% of the students who took the test. You did better than 30% of the students. So that means it doesn't come prepackaged with a particular criterion. But for the purpose of using teacher evaluation, sometimes we need to think about it the way we think about the statewide value-added models. What isn't important is that what percentage of students you got to proficient, but how much growth the student showed over the course of the year. So we try to mimic that whatever possible. Again, the Superintendent Jenkins, and I know a couple of you have already commented on this idea of equity and trying to make sure that our evaluation system is as equitable as possible. And one of the ways that we ensure equity in the evaluation system is making sure that it's based on growth rather than some target of proficiency, wanting to make sure that every student is able to show growth and wanting to make sure that teachers are held accountable for growth rather than hitting a predetermined target. That's what our statewide system does with student learning growth. We try to do that with our local system whenever possible as well.
Thank you, Dr. McKelvey. All right. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Well, I'll weigh in next, and I'm going to bounce all over the place here, board members. Forgive me. And Ms. Colbert, your thoughts were wonderfully well organized and cogent, and you came prepared. Mine are not as much so. So if I seem to bounce like a pinball from bumper to bumper, just bear with me. But I think we're all probably going to end up weighing in on this eventually. I think the direction we're headed in, Dr. Jenkins, is a good direction. I support it as you've laid out tonight. I think we need to hear more. I do agree completely that in a district such as ours, with the extremely high mobility that we have in our district, that frankly, I think it's fair not only to the student, but to their family and to the teacher whose pay is being based on that assessment to have a common final, because it does assure some commonality, as those students oftentimes, as we all too well know on this board, can sometimes move 2, 3, 4 times a year in a single school year. And, early on in my involvement with Orange County Public Schools, that was a big issue that we have addressed over the last 10 years, but portfolios, for example, moving with students and students being able to pick up seamlessly when they get to a new school. And I think it's important for anybody that's watching this or listening to know that it's not hyperbole to say that we literally have hundreds, if not thousands, of students who do move 2 to 3 times per year routinely, year in and year out. So I support that. I'm totally opposed, and I agree with the superintendent, to basing a teacher's evaluation upon a reading score if that's not the topic they teach. And frankly, I would think that's totally inequitable, unfair. As long as we have a merit pay law in the books where the assessment of the student and whether that student is showing learning gains as part of the teacher's pay, I think it's absolutely imperative that we have some type of assessment that assesses that teacher on what they are teaching and not on a course that they are not teaching. So for those districts that have gone to that system, frankly, if I were a representative of the teachers in those districts, I would be very, very unhappy, because we're reverting to a system where their pay is being based on something that they simply don't test. I've weighed in with the superintendent on this. I think she's putting together, she may have already sent it to me today and I didn't get it. I know it may be expensive to come up with proctors during testing season, but if there's a top 3 issue for me, and I'm going to have to be dissuaded mightily with cost, I don't want to say I would spend anything to do it, but I would spend pretty much close to anything to do it. We have got to figure out a way to pay for non-teacher proctors to administer these tests. I am so tired of hearing, and I think it's valid criticism, my wife, my children, our friends' children talk about school pretty much shutting down for 4 or 5 weeks and no learning or teaching going on in the classroom because the teachers are proctoring for 4 straight weeks, 5 straight weeks, 6 straight weeks. And it's gone beyond the realm of anecdote to me. I don't think it's anecdotal. I think it's real. And I think that we've got to make sure that instruction is continuing in the classroom during the testing season. I'm sure there's incredible variability from school to school. I'm sure that some principals are very good at making sure teachers are in the classroom and still instructing, but I think there are probably other principals that are not as good at it. And that learning grinding to a halt during testing season is simply unacceptable to me. I completely support field testing, as you've proposed, Dr. Jenkins. And the more we can hold harmless as we roll out these tests, the better. I think it's what this state should have done. You know, I need to be educated more by Dr. McKelvey and Mr. Gilbert and others, and I mean that sincerely. So I hope y'all are not shy about making an appointment, coming in and seeing me on anything I say here. Anybody on your staff up there where it's clear from what I say from the dais where I need a little bit more education. Because what I'm about to say, y'all may disagree with it or you may agree with it, but I have great reluctance using personally, and this is not part of your recommendation, Dr. Jenkins, but if we end up going in a direction where we use the SAT or the ACT or the Iowa assessment or the Stanford assessment as a substitute for common finals or for our own created test, I'm going to really need to be convinced of that, because I don't think that's the purpose of the SAT. And if teacher pay is based on that, then we're going to start teaching to the SAT and teaching to the ACT and teaching to the Iowa assessment, teaching to the Stanford assessment or whatever other test we use. I'm not familiar with those other tests, but I'm very familiar with the SAT. I'm very, very familiar because my daughter is about to take it for the 4th time, the ACT. And, those are used to measure readiness for college, but they're used to measure it in a very, I know this is not a testing term, Dr. McKelvey, so forgive my misappropriating it, but they're used to measure things, everything from vocabulary to reading comprehension to analytical and logical skills. That doesn't mean that they're used to measure pure mastery of algebra or trigonometry or pure measure of English lit or pure measure of American history. Those districts that are going to those college entrance exams as their assessment instruments, again, if I had someone smarter than me, and there's a lot of folks in this room smarter than me on this topic, to come and say, no, it's actually a good measure, I'd be open-minded, but I'd really have to be convinced of that because I just don't think that's a proper use of those tests. I think teacher fairness is a very, very big part of this. That's why I'm supportive of where we're going, and I think that those who really have issues with testing in general need to realize that there is an aspect of teacher fairness in this because we are bound by the merit pay law of this state, and an assessment is part of the merit pay law, and it is a built-in part, even though it was just amended to lower it, the percentage, but it is a built-in part of the teacher pay. Lastly, and this is totally off the reservation as well, but I've shared this with Dr. Jenkins, I think the one thing that we never talk about up here, at least I've never heard it brought up, that I'm going to bring up is what really gives parents heartburn over these tests is not having the test results shared with them so they can work with their children on improving their children's performance on the test. I know that's a big issue because I know a lot of work and effort and goes into those tests, and I know that you destroy the efficacy of the test if you have to throw it out each year and start anew. But I don't know if there's a way to do, say, for example, what the SAT does and what the ACT does, where you can give parents on an assessment categories of how their student performed. For example, when you get your ACT results, it says that you got 9 out of 12 questions right in the analytical reasoning section, or you got 8 out of 10 questions right in the reading comprehension portion. So you know where your students' weaknesses are, and if you're like me and you have a high school student and you're trying to help them get a good ACT score, you can have their tutor or whatever work with them on the area that they're consistently scoring poorly in. I think we've got to figure out a way to do that. I don't know how. I don't know, but we've got to have a way to figure out how to sit down, because most of our parents, I'd like to believe, are engaged and they want to make sure that their student performs at a high level. But they get very frustrated, and y'all's nods tell me that you've heard this frustration too. You know what? we were told that they did this or that, but we're not told what they missed or what they did poorly on or what we need to work with our kid on. And you know, a lot of teachers are good at getting with the parent and letting them know that, but I think we need a little bit more transparency there. So those are my thoughts. Thank you for entertaining them, and let me turn it over to you for yours, Ms. Gould. Dr. Jenkins?
Thank you, Chairman. I just was going to make 2 points for you. $544,000 is the cost for the Kelly subs for proctoring in place of teachers and other staff. I want to make sure folks understand other staff besides teachers are proctoring as well. But about $544,000 is the estimate of what it would cost to hire Kelly subs for the proctoring. I especially like your comment about the feedback. Brandon and his staff are looking at ways to get additional feedback because we have the actual blueprints and a matching of test items to the actual curriculum or to the standards and the course content. I think that's something we can potentially work on. So I'm glad you brought that up for the rest of the group to hear. And just interestingly enough, some of our neighboring districts are actually putting in a request to the department that they will be allowed to not participate in FSA, and instead of FSA, actually use SAT and ACT as well. I think that is just as problematic as what you've brought up, though. I wanted to add that to the concerns.
Well, and frankly, that's why I made that comment, because I knew of that, and I don't support that. And we haven't suggested going there. But let me say this. For me alone, and I'm not speaking obviously for anybody on this board, $544,000 is money well spent. And, you know, and I think that if we went out to our parents and said, hey, and I'm not saying it would come from this source, Dr. Jenkins, but hey, you know that $1 million you supported? Because I think this would be an appropriate use of that, not necessarily completely recurring funds because it will expire, but we want to spend $544,000 of it to make sure that instruction's continuing in the classroom. I would defend that till the cows come home myself. Ms. Gould.
I'm not going to repeat what others have said. You've all articulated it very well. I have probably more off the reservation comments. I'll start actually with the proctoring. I had brought this up before, and I think it would help on 2 points that I wanted to highlight. On the proctoring, is there a way that we could take non-instructional staff, especially from the district offices, and have them cross-utilized like Disney does during their peak times? They still have to bring in seasonal staff to supplement, but it sends the message, and it also puts people who are not in regular contact at the front line in touch with the front line, which brings me to the second point. You all know that I have what I call table talks once a month, and I alternate my months. Well, this month was staff, and I had a couple of teachers approach me, and they're not, they're tired, but they're not fully getting the communication that, one, we appreciate them, or that, two, that the central office staff truly understands what they're going through. And I don't think that's the case. I think that not only do we have empathy and sympathy, but we're living it with them here at the central district office, but I don't think they perceive that. And so if there is some way to beef up the communications, not just in the sense of giving them the facts, which this does, and what we're trying to do to move forward, but how much we appreciate them for sticking this out with us, and as we work through it with the state, I think that's vitally important. And I don't think we can say thank you often enough between now and the last day of school and the beginning of the next school year. It's just been a tough year all the way around, and that's not just teachers. That is all the way to the bus drivers, because they feel the stress. That is just through and through. So that was that piece. And also, what else? I am asked constantly, specifically, what do you want me to advocate for? I don't have trouble picking up the phone to the legislators. I don't have trouble, going to Washington if we have to. But specifically, how do we keep in line and keep that pressure on? So I think the more we can continually articulate especially as we go into the summer months. This is not going to be the end. This is the beginning of really the evolution of this new accountability system that we're going into. You said it very well. It took 10 years to get here, and now we have this 2-month time frame where we have to get it all right. 2 weeks. Just like at the beginning of the year, we had a couple of weeks to get all the benchmark tests done with zero direction. So it's that same thing. We're going to continue to work through these issues and right size it for our kids and our future. But I think we need to have communication points that are very well articulated out between now, the end of this session, and the beginning of the next session, so that it's not just during session that they're hearing these things, but we continue to indicate. The other thing, and this is because I have a legislator that I work with that's particularly interested in this area, is will the changes that you're presenting for those non-core classes really be able to bring back with comfort things like the choir and those programmatic that we didn't know how to evaluate a teacher? And I know we're moving in that direction, but how do we give them comfort that it's okay to bring that stuff back and you're not going to get dinged as a school and a teacher? Like show choir, like I've heard that some things are cut. We were talking about the science labs earlier. Those things that, there's not necessarily a direct class. It may be an extracurricular. It may be after school. It may be a class they take, but it's, they're an engineering major, but they have an affinity and a talent, and it's an outlet for them. Drama, those programs that kind of come up that got squished down. They didn't get fully eliminated across the board, but they were definitely squished down, and I think they're still feeling squished. How do we help them bring those things back that keep kids in school and engaged and excited about coming to school, especially during particularly tough times? It's the time they go let off that steam and do something that takes them out of the study mode, especially as sophomores and juniors, when they're not only in our test modes, but they are taking ACTs and SATs and sometimes 2 or 3 times and other assessments. And if they're in AP classes like mine, he's got 4 AP tests coming up. I mean, if he didn't have orchestra, I think he'd explode. And gaming, but that's a little difficult because I have his cord right now. So, it's just so intense. So those are the things that were on my list. The proctor, those other things. How do we communicate? How do we give a lot of love? And, I think we are going in the right direction. We're going to need to continue to tweak.
Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Ms. Gould. Just 2 quick comments. We do have some central office staff that do proctoring, but because any of our adults in central office positions, if they will go through the training, just very brief training and preparation, there is no reason why we can't use some additional or count on additional professional staff to go out and help with proctoring. That will certainly cut the cost as well. So let us take a look at that. But I do want you to know we have assistants and proctors that go out to help. The notion of expanding again some of those electives, I want you to keep in mind the narrowing was due to low enrollment of some of those courses. I believe what we use to try to narrow it down is if you had fewer than 100, then it's probably not district-wide, then it's probably not significant enough. Yeah, so let us go back and take a look at that. There was one very popular one. I won't say it because it's named after a television show, but there was one in particular that was popular. We'll go back and take a look. Certainly now that they don't, it wasn't just that they didn't have to have EOCs though. The notion was we were sort of being extremely creative with some television shows and things, and we wanted to make sure we were having pretty solid curriculum there. So we'll take a look at that as well.
And I think we had a lot of fight or flight reaction at the beginning of all this, especially at the beginning of the school year when we didn't know what was coming. We didn't know how we were going to assess it. We did, I just would, if we can relieve that stress valve a little bit, we might see a little bit more of that come.
Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with all the comments that my fellow board members have made. I think there are so many levels of frustration on this topic. And just one of them is when we have people who write us and say, just stand up to Tallahassee and say no. It's just so much more complex than just, as you said, Ms. Colbert, you just can't do it. So I find that frustrating. But I do agree with what everyone was saying about a common final, and it's also a fairness to students. We've had the issue of AP test being used in different ways among the high schools. That was a concern to parents. One school or teacher will take the AP test and let that really dictate the final. Another teacher at another school will include classwork. So if the classwork wasn't as stellar as the test, it might bring them down, or somebody who did really well and didn't do well on the test, it affects their final grade. So I think that's a really pertinent example of being consistent and fair across the district. So I think, to me, that's a reason for having a common final. So that was just what I wanted to add to the discussion. I agree with everyone. They were very eloquent in how they presented their case, and I thank Ms. Colbert for her really good review of the situation now and as it matches up to our accountability resolution. So I thank you for that.
Thank you, Ms. Flynn. Mrs. Robinson.
I have a couple follow-up questions probably for Dr. McKelvey, if that's okay, Dr. Jenkins. When you were discussing student growth, and this is a conversation I had with several of my email exchanges, when we talk about using the student assessments, like let's just choose second grade, the Iowa, for the purposes of evaluating the teacher, and we use student growth, is it that, and I think I know, but I'm just asking, is it student growth from beginning of the year to the end of the year, or is it literally the student growth from the teacher's last year's kids to this year's kids? Do you understand my question?
I do.
Okay.
It makes a lot of sense. And in most cases, it's the latter. And that's what we do with, for example, the statewide assessments and the statewide value-added models. The fourth grade teacher, their learning growth is based on the difference between those summative fourth grade scores and the pretest, that we would call it, is those third grade summative scores. So that's how that transition works. Now, you can tell, though, that there's a bit of a gap, right? A difficulty in the transition if you didn't have something in the prior year, or if you didn't have that prior year exactly in that same area that you had this year. So one example would be, what happens the first year you take Spanish 1? What happens the first year you take some other elective courses? So there's a lot of ways that we do it. And I don't want to get too deeply, but I'll get as deeply as you want me to, into how we do it. But we tend to call it a calculated pretest. So we say there are certain types of skills that students have, maybe in reading or mathematics and other subjects, that are very consistent, very strong, and do provide some information about how they will do in future years in other subjects. And then once you have a larger kind of basket of assessments to base that pretest on, then it becomes easier and easier to get an idea of, well, how much does a student grow in a year? What does a year's growth look like in your first year in a Spanish course, or in your first year in a Russian course, or your first year in an art course? So that's kind of what that does. That meantime, though, can be very difficult. And that's one of many of the reasons why Superintendent Jenkins has directed us to think about this as being able to use our discretion as a district to hold teachers harmless. Because as you can imagine, when you're building those models, when you're getting those calculated pretests, when you're getting that baseline data in place, you have years where you're trying to learn about the data. You're trying to see what happens. So it's actually an extremely difficult question. And it's one where we rely on our great staff. We rely on expertise that we have. We rely on the relationships that we have across the country, either other psychometric departments at universities, other school districts. There are just some university centers that do research modeling, value-added modeling, student learning growth modeling, but it's a very difficult and complex area. We do our best to try to explain it. You know, this idea of pre and post, it is kind of hard to wrap the mind around a little bit.
Okay. Another one. to one of Mr. Sublet's comments when he was talking about we'd like to have parents, and I hear this too, parents want to hear feedback on, and I understand the secrecy around FSA. And I have not had a child take FSA because I don't have that age this year, but I have had FCAT. And in the past, is FSA going to give us what FCAT did? Because FCAT did give you a list of, say, under math. You had your math score, but then you had areas, you know. Is FSA going to also have that? So I could tell my son didn't do well in algebraic theory or whatever the different. Are we going to have that with FSA?
So I'm going to do one of those things where I'm going to answer a question with complexity, but
Okay.
hopefully not in a way that inspires more
Okay.
questions. So if I do a poor job with this, please let me know. I'll try again.
You're doing great.
We had, you might be referring to something in the FCAT we called like content areas, content focus areas, right? And so maybe let's just say a math assessment has 3 different areas. And let's say they each were worth, you could have 10 questions that potentially could be a correct. And in area 1, you got 8. In area 2, you got 6. In area 3, you got 7. The problem is that and the whole assessment altogether has 30 points, right? The problem is that that whole assessment has a certain kind of difficulty of questions and complexity questions on the assessment that is balanced for that entire assessment and kind of anchored and equated year over year. But each of those individual areas might be more or less difficult year over year. It's the assessment as a whole that kind of has to hold together. You're doing that, you're setting achievement level based on the whole assessment, not just those individual areas. So you get those scores back, and they can be useful. And I agree with what the chairman said earlier. I know that when I took tests, I looked at those areas, and I didn't know quite as much about assessment then as I do now, so I may have not been so rough on myself for maybe missing questions in certain areas. And then figuring out why, if I got them all right this time, why couldn't I just get that last one in the next area, right? Well, that's because those difficult questions bounced around. Those most complex questions bounced around. So what we try to do is give some information back. And this, by the way, is the same kind of, you can imagine the same struggle in benchmark assessments, right? Where when you're split up by standard, you're making sure the whole assessment fits together. But that doesn't mean every single standard, right, is going to then have the same amount of high difficulty questions or high complexity questions. You'd have to have a 300 question assessment to do that. And no one wants to take a 300 question assessment. I don't want to take a 300 question assessment. So that's some of the trade-offs that you have in an assessment, right? And with each assessment, you have to kind of go into it and say, what's the purpose of the assessment? And I feel like that's what you're getting to. What's the purpose of the assessment, and how do we meet as best as we can multiple purposes of the assessment? So when we ask an assessment to do 10, 15 different things, we often create those tensions. We can't both provide all the information that we might like to ideally and keep it as secure enough to use for evaluation, or maybe do something else that we want to come from the assessment. These are kind of the tensions that we face. So we will get some of those either sub-scores, content focus scores, area scores, whatever we want to call them from the new assessment. We want to make sure that the interpretation makes sense, because we don't want a school to say, hey, we averaged 7 in this area last year, now we averaged 6 this year. What are we doing wrong? We've just got to improve in this area. Well, that's not really how the assessment design works. It may just be you had harder questions in that area, and that's not information that we get from the outside. Mm-hmm. For ours that we receive, though, whatever the superintendent directs us to do, I mean, we can try to do our best to support. I know one of the things that is in CSHB 7069 are ways that districts, some things we have to do, some things they're trying to guide us to do about how we present this information to parents and teachers, and the reporting deadlines for some of these things as well. Some of them have been helped with the movement to computer-based testing, though as we can see from the FSA rollout, if you don't have the right vendor, if you haven't done the right preparation, it can cause problems on the other side as well, having expanded computer-based testing. But these are part of those trade-offs of how you get the data back quickly and how it's meaningful. And I think it goes back to that tension of when you ask an assessment to do too many things, you have all of these competing demands that run against the assessment, and those all pull you in different directions. We try to do our best to balance, but sometimes the ones that are just hard and fast statutes, so for example, evaluation, tend to trump some of those other uses.
Okay, the $1 million question. When FOIL meets with DOE May 6th and 7th, do we think they're going to tell us how they plan to do their validity assessment of FSA that's part of that bill? We're supposed to, do we think they're going to tell us how they plan to do that?
The only thing I can speak to that I'm aware of is that there is a large 3.5-4 hour segment that is based solely on CSHP 7069. We just don't have any other information at that point. The only thing we know is exactly what you all have seen in the bill. That there's
do you think it's valid?
Dr. Jenkins?
That's a tough question.
I would, Chairman, I will tell you, I probably wouldn't bet my life savings on it. I would probably not. But I think you raise a very critical issue, because when you talk about timelines, if you don't have the validity study completed, this is a question Brandon and Gina and the rest of the team will be posing. If you don't have validity test studies completed, how do you release scores or grades? That's going to be brought up. I cannot promise you that it will be answered.
Okay, one last thing, and this is probably not necessarily for Brandon, so feel free to sit if you'd like to. I'm just going to read one little paragraph from an email that I've been going back and forth with one particular mom, who actually is a mom, but she's also a teacher for OCPS. And her concerns have been wrapped around more what we were discussing a while ago, where the goal of it would be to just have school and then the tests happen at the end of the year and not have everything wrapped around it. So she said, we went back to that the school board makes policy. We make policy, and we hire the superintendent to implement the policy we've put in place. And she says, well, then make a policy. So I'm going to read this to you. Please advocate for our students by making policies that can safeguard them from the detrimental repercussions of the high-stakes testing the state and federal government continue to shove down our throats. You may not be able to change the laws, but we can pass policies to protect them. She means protect the students. And so I've sent back to her. I have not heard back. We've gone back and forth for days. I haven't heard back from her. I said, what policy do you want us to make? I mean, that's valid. And I said to her, as soon as I said it, I said, that's a valid question. I'm not trying to be rhetorical here. I want a real answer. Because it's not that simple. And I think that's where she and I finally come to, is it's not as simple as it sounds. We can't just make a policy that overrides the law. So anyway, I'm just telling you, I just wanted to read that to you, and that's the frustration. And I feel that. I do feel it. And if we can, it's everyone's frustrated. If we could figure that out. So I'm just throwing that out. You don't have to answer anything. Thanks.
Ms. Moore.
Thank you for all of you going first. I think there was just really great dialogue and discussion tonight, so I don't really want to go back over same ground, but pretty much in support of what my colleagues have said here on the board. Dr. Jenkins, we know that when the session started, we were hearing the reformers saying they wanted fewer, better tests, and I think certainly that's where we ended up. The question remains in terms of, and you have to look at the overarching goals of what we see out of Tallahassee and those that really control ed policy. We're not seeing them necessarily going away from the high stakes natures of things. They're still wanting to grade schools. They're still staying with Common Core standards. They're still staying with FSA. Those are really, to me, the elephants in the room. And so now that they have sent all of this back down to us, there's a little part of my political mind that wonders how much of it was calculated to then take the angst in these conversations and move it back to school board chambers rather than Tallahassee. Because it really was, let's be honest, it was very convenient to say, well, they did this, they did that, they did this, they did that. Now to have the conversation, it was really challenging. Some of these emails this year, it was almost impossible to have the conversation in an email fashion because there was so much information that they would imply, the writer would imply, and that I knew, and we were all coming from a completely different frame of reference. So all of that is an introduction to say, I know you've been just tasked the last few days, and Mrs. Cobert did a wonderful job of making us focus on, it's completely understandable where the public would be. That, oh, great, they have fewer, better tests. Oh, good, so we don't have to do this, we don't have to do that. It just sounded so mom and apple pie, and all of a sudden, these guns that have been pointed towards Tallahassee were now coming across our emails. So I don't know if you've had any time, because you've worked exceptionally hard, Dr. Jenkins, on that 3-page document, which I think it'll be great for us to excerpt and put out in our communications. So maybe in the next few months we can tell where DOE is going, because I think if you don't always keep the overall philosophy of those in charge of what they're really trying to accomplish, you can't respond correctly. So if you had a chance to evaluate it on a deeper level, we were in the weeds, and we needed to be tonight. And we're going to need to be with our parents, but do you have any sense of where we're going so that we can be prepared?
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Moore, I think a couple of things come to mind. I certainly don't have a crystal ball to prognosticate what will actually happen. I will tell you, I've had several conversations, and I don't mind, and quite frankly, the commissioner doesn't mind responding to my concerns. My guess is we are going to go through an extended period of uncertainty until we have a validity story on FS. Validity story. I hope it's not a story. A validity study. If you remember, there are 3 individuals who will select a psychometrician or company or consultant to conduct that validity story. Speaker of the House, President of the Senate, Governor have to agree on selecting, doesn't say anything about the commissioner, I don't believe, Dr. McKelvey. Those 3 have to select someone who is going to conduct the validity study. Fast forward, depending on that selection and the agreement of those 3 individuals, the study has to be conducted, and then somebody has to verify it and release it. So my guess is the state will find themselves, and I'm hopeful of this outcome. I've said this to the commissioner, that the state will find themselves needing to back down and say, you know what, this first year really can only be a baseline or an initial year. It's really inappropriate to try to administer grades and any other high stakes outcomes based on these scores. Now, I could be wrong, because that selection from those 3 individuals might be ready to be signed and delivered, and the study ready to be conducted. If that is the case, sometime in the month of June, we may get a release of outcomes. Might just happen. I wouldn't predict that, but we might actually get outcomes. And based on those outcomes, we will be in a predicament of trying to put forward policies and conduct different remediation and retention and promotion strategies than we're looking at today. So I will be very hopeful for further feedback on those areas in the morning on the conference call. Certainly, we will look forward to the FOIL meeting, but every week we're trying to have conference calls with the commissioner and with her staff in hopes that there will be some kind of resolution. The biggest issue is whether or not they're going to release those scores in June and try to administer grades. That in effect has impact on some additional decisions. I don't see how they can release it, but I have no idea if they've already kind of selected who they're going to put forward for the validity study. Do you have any ideas, Dr. McKelvey? They haven't announced it, at least, but they may be in discussions. Maybe they're going to be ready in the next week or so to have someone conduct that study. If it's a thorough study, it shouldn't be done in a week's time or in 2 weeks' time, in our opinion. It should take some time, which means pushing back releasing of data, and I hope that results in really what would equate to a baseline year for FSA as well. That's my hope.
Mr. Chair, just to follow to that. So I liked what you said, an extended period of uncertainty. So that's probably the first place where the uncertainty will be. And then at some point, if, you have to take all these past what if this happened, we could be facing grades, in situations like we've seen in other states where the grades drop. We don't know. So just your final comment is, depending on which path we end up, and you certainly spoke of the first juncture of this validity test from the psychometricians, do you sort of see that then how that works itself out will continue a period of uncertainty?
I think my recommendation to OCPS would be to move forward aggressively with our PR and making sure folks understand if they release grades, we are going to be very aggressive in how we communicate what we believe is appropriate about a baseline year and grading. We've got that all loaded and ready to go. And we will move forward. I will tell you, if we don't hear anything further, we are prepared by the end of next week to move forward with our plans for both remediation and for promotion and retention decisions. We will move forward without the direction.
So, and then maybe this is a final question for the chair. Then, we certainly have a lot of interest from from the anti-testing folks and the PT and the parents and all these different groups. It's just such, like Dr. Jenkins said, a period of uncertainty. Hopefully we can get through this period, as a team, and we can continue to dialogue and take the time. I mean, we're taking extensive time tonight, but it's probable we'll have to continue to do these along the way, because there are so many little pieces. If a parent or a group or even one of us misses one little piece of information or something that shifted, you could have an opinion that would be wrong-headed just because you didn't know something because of all this uncertainty. So I didn't know if you had any final, and I'm done, words of wisdom of how we can get through this very carefully, because up to this point, honestly, Tallahassee was pretty much setting the stage for all of it, and now we're going to have a greater role, and it's going to be really critical that we do it in the appropriate fashion and hold our parents, our teachers, ourselves together and give each other some room to be able to navigate these uncertain waters. So I just wondered if you had some advice.
I really don't, beyond what's already been said. I think we just need to wait to see what comes out of the May 6th, 7th meetings. I think we need to figure out what comes out of the legislature. I have a feeling this is going to be a working process. What I fear more than anything is, and I don't think this is even a remote possibility, but if that validity assessment comes back negative on the FSA, I think the state's going to be in full-blown meltdown. And I think we're going to have to manage that. Now, knowing the way the legislative process works and knowing who is selecting the validity assessor, I do not think that will be the outcome. But I'm hopeful that it will be a hold harmless period. What pains me, and forgive me, I don't want to go too much off track. You didn't ask for this, but I do want to say this. It's a shame that it took a full-scale parental revolt in this state to get the legislature to wake up and smell the coffee. It really is. Because, even some folks in this room don't realize this. We have been members of this board. And forgive me, Dr. Jenkins, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I hate to include you in this, but you as well. Other senior educational leaders in this state have been warning legislative leaders and members of our delegation for the last year and a half of the impending train wreck. And I will never forget, and I don't know that I'll ever get over it, and it's going to sound like so much ego, going before the legislative delegation about 12 months ago and saying to them, you don't realize the groundswell of opposition and the revolt going on out there. It's no longer just the opt-out crowd. It's rank-and-file parents. It's teachers. It's administrators. You have created the perfect storm by, at the same time, throwing out FCAT, going to a new untested FSA assessment, adding on to that merit pay, adding on to that end-of-course assessments in a district like ours of over 1,000 courses. And, y'all were there. Some of you were at that delegation meeting. We were met with hostility and hostile questions and were treated as if We were just, revolutionaries who were against accountability and against assessment and thought that there should be no standards. I mean, that's how we were treated. And frankly, I think that's common throughout the state. And the problem with that type of approach of governing by the legislature is that they are, and they have been, in a reactive mode for the last 12 months. And I don't think you ever do effective governance when you're simply reacting. And it's poor Dr. Jenkins has had to listen to me rant about this ad nauseum for the last 12 months, and some of you, as Mr. Rodriguez has, and others, and it's very, very frustrating because Miss Gordon always assumes because I was in the legislature and that they somehow listened to me, or that they somehow listened to you, Miss Moore. Even close friends of mine in the Florida legislature, I could tell even when I would try to talk to them about this issue, their eyes glaze over, and frankly, it was going in one ear and out the other, and it frustrates me because I'm on record, and I continue to believe in accountability. But we've gone too far, and they went too far, too fast, and without really thinking through the ramifications. And now, it's fallen down to the parents and the teachers and the students and the school boards to clean up the mess. And that's very, very frustrating. And then, frankly, that's what I feel like we've been doing for the last 12 months, cleaning up the legislative mess. Ms. Cadle.
I don't have a whole lot more to add other than to say, it seems like I've been fighting this forever. And like Chairman Sublette said, we have warned, we have talked. I talked to someone who introduced me one time as his new best friend, who he has all this respect for. And I said, you need to understand, this is a train wreck that has already left the station. We have been trying to tell Tallahassee for months that, the two trains are headed this way and they're going to collide. And here are the things you need to be concerned about. And the thing that bothers me the most is how many people tell me I'm not an education expert, so I just have to count on other people to tell me. Well, I can also argue that if you truly want jobs in the state of Florida, and you truly want economic development and a healthy Florida, you have a train wreck getting ready to happen. And Becky Couch was sitting with me at FSBA days in the legislature, and they have run a simulation based on last year's numbers of what Duval County will look like with taking the FCAT data from last year with the new accountability measures. And it's not pretty. And when you've got some of the major economic engines of Florida having to look, so, talking about getting out in front of this and that our children didn't get dumber in 1 year, it's going to be crucial. And something that Miss Robinson said, and I don't know, somewhere in my career, I went to a dinner that had all of these inspirational things in front of us. And this has been at my board seat, and people who sit here go, what a great quote. Albert Einstein said, you have to learn the rules of the game, and then you have to play better than anyone else. And I think the superintendent and her staff have worked really, really hard. As she has told us on numerous times, we have a sandbox that legally we have to stay within. But we can push the corners of the sandbox. And I know she probably didn't appreciate me calling and saying, we already did this. Everybody in the state is getting credit for doing what we did. But for some reason, when we did it, it wasn't important. Or nobody thought, that we were pushing the envelope. maybe we didn't say we were doing away with the final exams and only doing EOCs, but when Ms. Colbert gave us the list of what everybody's talking about, I'm like, can you tell me what they're doing that we're not doing, that they're getting credit for, that we did before anybody else? And we're not getting any credit for it, except that we haven't said we want to do ACT or SAT or whatever and get rid of FSA. And so I think that has been my frustration, is we have been working really, really hard. But to all the parent advocates, you know, it goes back in, and I have shared this story on more than one occasion. When Fund Education Now started, and I was up meeting in different offices because I was chairman of the school board, and, you know, you guys were giving me the talking points, and off I went to Tallahassee. I wish I could tell you how many people wanted to know what the money was behind Fund Education Now. And I kept saying, there is no money. And they're like, oh yeah, there is. But I said, there is no money. They are mad moms. And it's like the mad moms put up with a lot until you cross that line in the sand. And when you cross that line in the sand, they are not going to back down. And I mean, you can go back. We're getting ready to celebrate 145 years of history in Orange County Public Schools. I bet we can find different lines that have been crossed that the parents stepped up and revolted on. And I can think of a couple during when I was a parent, and one of them you all are going to find hard to believe, but my oldest child in 9th grade, if you had perfect attendance, you didn't have to take a final, and you didn't have to take a semester exam, which was great, except when they went to college. And the fail rate of those children, because they never took a final exam, was astronomical, because they went to school every day. They showed up every day. They did their work every day. And I can remember the parents going, we can't prepare children to send them to college if they don't have to take a test at least twice during the year that shows. And so, I mean, that was a parent revolt back in the 90s. And let's see, he graduated in 95. So that would have happened in 91, probably, that the parents said, this isn't okay anymore. So I think you can go back in our history and find, and this is the time, you know, we have crossed that line. But I also think what Ms. Robinson said, I wish we could just whoop and change it. But we have laws we have to follow. And until we get those laws changed, we're going to do the best we can to protect our teachers and our children and our community. And I would argue we're going to do the best we can to make sure that we can continue to develop the economic forces that we need for an Orange County that we're going to be proud of for the next 50 years.
Well said. Mrs. Robinson.
I have another question, Dr. Jenkins. It's if it's okay for Dr. McKelvey, if he knows the answer. Another conversation, since we're having this huge conversation, I'm going to throw as many things out there as I can. A couple people have asked me what's going to happen. Do we know what's going to happen with the students who chose this year to opt out of the test, to minimally participate?
So we do know some things because of the new statute. So the statute has been written slightly differently now in CSHB 7069, where students have to receive a level 2, a score of level 2 or higher, in order to be automatically promoted to the next grade. So what there was before is a little bit of confusion in the law of what happened when students received scores that weren't scores. Basically a score that wasn't an achievement level, not even a score, really just a value. And we've had these values in our assessment system for years. We've had values for students who got sick before the assessment, who answered one question and an emergency happened. This has not been anything that's been created in the last few years. So it's very clear in statute now that in order to get that credit, in order to be promoted to 4th grade, you have to get an achievement level 2, 3, 4, or 5 on the statewide assessment. I don't know if that helps.
Is that just
to
for
answer
3rd grade?
So in the other grade levels, and this goes back to what Superintendent Jenkins says that we're still awaiting clarification for, is we do not know exactly what the interpretation of the district flexibility and the retention and the promotion laws are. And then you couple that with what we discussed earlier, which is not knowing whether or not the scores are going to come and the time when they're required by statute, which is the week of June 8th. So until we have those questions answered, we know that the district now has increased flexibility for retention and promotion, but we don't know, to use the analogy that we're just using about the walls of the sandbox, we don't know how far the walls of the sandbox extend. We know that will be increased. We just don't know to what extent, and we've had some little bit of clarification of the walls of the sandbox for students taking the 3rd grade assessment in the way that I just described.
And do we know yet, or is that all still to be determined, about how it will impact teacher evaluations if a teacher had a student or two that minimally participated this year? And then I guess we don't know for schools yet, but for teachers, do we know yet?
Well, one thing that we do know is that these codes that students might receive for not answering enough questions to get a score on the assessment, students have received in prior years. And so if you didn't have a score in the prior year and then the current year, that student wasn't able to be a part of your calculation. So we can't do these counterfactuals about would they have done better than the average of the students in the course and maybe would have done better or worse. I mean, those are counterfactuals that by definition we can't answer because we don't know. We don't have the data. We do know, as Superintendent describes, that by August 1st, the state has to come up with two things, right? Those uniform procedures that we have to follow for the submission and the evaluation and the monitoring of our instructional administrative evaluation plans. They also have to define uniform cut scores that we have to use for the statewide value-added models. Some of those things have to be included in that, right? Because you have to, if you're going to have uniform cut points and cut scores, you have to have uniform rules about how all of these things are considered. And they have to be statewide rules because they have to be executed at the state level. So I can't tell you now what's in that because we haven't received the rule text, but that's why I'm making a commitment to the superintendent that when we do have that rule text, we'll do our best job to analyze that rule text and provide that to her so that she can share that information with you.
So let me make sure I understand about towards the teacher's evaluation.
Yeah.
At this present moment, a child who minimally participated doesn't count towards or against a teacher because you can't, because there's no score. Is that correct?
Well, I want to be clear that I don't want to define it at the level of participation. I just want to define it on the outcome, right? Mm-hmm. What a student received or didn't receive. If you didn't receive a score, an achievement level, and a scale score, you, for all intents and purposes, didn't get a value for that assessment. And that's not a rule for this year or the past year. We've had value-added scores produced by the state since 2011, and that's how they've been handled. That's how students in that scenario have been handled by the statewide evaluation system.
I want you to repeat, because I don't want folks to miss that first portion, Dr. McKelvey, about the student and what the laws now state in the new law about students who do not complete the exam. That's pretty important.
And specifically as it relates to the third grade students?
Yeah, and again, that's why we're looking to send information out after that meeting on the 6th, because we're hoping for further clarification there. But repeat what you said about third grade, because that's important for parents to be aware of.
Absolutely. So as you know, there are two grade levels, right, where there are in reading, where there are those specific requirements that are attached to the achievement levels that a student receives at third grade and at 10th grade. So in third grade, in order to not meet that requirement where you would have to get a good cause promotion in order to be promoted to fourth grade, you have to score an achievement level 2, 3, 4, or 5, right? So you have to have a valid score of 2, 3, 4, or 5 in order to be promoted without a good cause exemption.
Okay. And we do have good cause exemption in place.
Absolutely. And there are multiple good cause exemptions. There's good cause exemption. We described one earlier with the Iowa assessment that a student could take and get a nationally norm reference score. And those are established by the Board of Education. There's the ability to participate in a student portfolio. There's certain other exceptions that are provided for ELL students or ESC students. There are a whole list of them that are required in statutes. And when we produce that information that the superintendent was describing about remediation and promotion, that's when we also produce those memos, as we do yearly, taking schools through all of the different ways that the students could receive that exemption.
And I know just from personal experience with my mentee, because he didn't pass the FCAT, 10th grade FCAT, they did have a provision that he could, if he got a certain score on the reading portion of ACT as a concordance score, which he did, yay, he's now he's done with the FCAT, but is that still in place? And is that number, it was 19, is it still that number, do we know, for this year?
The direction we've received, and this has been pretty consistent for the last year, that until new concordant and comparative scores are set, that we'll be able to use the concordant and comparative scores that we have at this time.
Okay.
So we've also sent out some communication to our principals through memos concerning this.
So the same thing for Algebra 1, EOC.
That's right.
The PERT.
That's right. Algebra 1, the PERT. The PERT is the only comparative. We have to call it a comparative because it was constructed slightly differently. But it's the only comparative score that we have for the Algebra 1 assessment at this time. And you described one of the ones that we have for ELA assessment. Obviously, SAT would work as well for that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You do such a great job, Brandon. Dr. Jenkins, one comment I did just kind of want to make, and you don't have to respond to it necessarily, unless you want to. One of the conversations that I've had with several people, it was in response to this year prior to the FSA season starting. You sent out a Connect Orange to all of our families talking about, you know, I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but something about if they opt out, you know, encouraging families to not let their children opt out. Anyway, these families that I've spoken with, these several people that I've spoken with, felt that that was aggressive, assertive, a little too tough-handed. And I just kind of wanted to point that out so that maybe going forward, you know, since we are in this all together and it is just something we are, I'm not saying I want everybody out there to opt out, but it is kind of a personal decision for them. And I agree that we need to point out to them, like we just did, that if they don't get a level 2, 3, or 4, 5, you know, they might. But I just want us to maybe just make sure we don't seem like we're bullying or pressuring. I don't know. So you don't have to respond to that unless you want to, but I'm just pointing out that that is a lot of comments around that.
So, you know, I have to respond because you used the word bullying. So that script was reviewed and previewed and melted down as many possible ways, ran it by some parents who thought it was quite well said. And we did receive some positive feedback for it as well. I certainly accept your feedback. Thank you.
Ms. Gobert.
Thank you. Just a few final comments here. One, I want to reiterate that it's really important that we provide a specific mechanism for our teachers and possibly even students to give feedback on our common finals so that we can, as we develop them, make them the best that they can be. I do think that we need to have a discussion. I don't know that it's tonight, but we need to have an ongoing discussion and clarification. What percentage will our common final exams count for students and how we will handle that? On the third grade retention and remediation issue, I think until we do have a rule text or decision from the Department of Education, that's an area where I think we can go our own way and develop our own rules for how we're going to handle those students, whether we're going to use those good cause exemptions, portfolio, whatnot. So in absence of direction from the Board of Education, I think that's an area where we do right by our students and we can make our own decisions. And I know Superintendent has done some of that. And in light of that, I think it's just extraordinarily important that we communicate these things to the public. Right now, there is massive confusion with the state making the announcement and passing House Bill 7069. All of a sudden, some teachers, some parents, very well educated parents said, that means we're not going to have this anymore. And that is not what the law says. So as we are, this is going to be fluid. This is going to be development in process over the next few weeks and next few months. I think communication is critical to our schools, to our teachers, and to our families, that this is how we're handling this and this is the reason why.
You know, I wish this hadn't come up, but I do want to weigh in. I don't think the message was inappropriate in the Connect Orange. I think it's very, very important as a school board that we not say to parents or convey in any manner whatsoever that complying with state law when it comes to the FSA assessments is an option. With refusing to comply is an option. Certainly, no child will be expelled, and every child has a federally guaranteed right to a public education. But I personally get very disturbed when a very small minority, and it is extremely small minority of parents, believes that they may not be hurting their child's educational advancement, their child's placement in courses, their child's ability to progress along a track they would like their child to progress upon. If their child chooses to opt out. Now, I want to be very, very careful how I say this because I'm sure it will be misconstrued. That is not Orange County Public School policy. That is state law. And that's even increasingly tied to federal funding. So I personally think the more that we can do to make sure parents are educated about the adverse implications of their child opting out, the better it is for those children and for those families, especially for those parents who may have been under the misimpression that they have a legal right to opt out. Again, they're correct when they say that there are no sanctions as far as their child continuing to attend public school. That is a federal right that they have. But there are all kinds of, and it's been well spelled out by FDOE, possible adverse impact on their child if they choose to go that route. I also think, and I've had some personal experience with this, that we need to make it clear that, listen, if you want to have your child opt out, that is, of course, your choice as a parent, and your choice as a parent who has complete control over your child and their decisions that they may make. But that we will not tolerate any child disrupting the testing environment for the rest of the school or for that class. And that's not meant in a threatening way, but I know of a number of examples where a child was sent to the school and was instructed, I would assume because this child was too young to have known to do this on their own, to go into class, show up on testing day, and to intentionally disrupt the entire class's testing environment until that child was removed from the class. And that just can't simply be tolerated. And I'm speaking as a parent now. You know, that infuriates me when my child's in there doing their best to get a good test score and to achieve in school, and yet their test is disrupted by 25, 30 minutes because some parents sent their child to school and said, hey, go in there and stand up and start making speeches and disrupting the test and literally shutting down the test. That happened. That happened. And actually, unfortunately, it happened multiple times. So, you know, that's not fair to the other children, and we just have to ensure that does not happen. Mrs. Robinson?
I just want to clarify that I am not accusing the superintendent's message of being bullying. That was just words. I want to clarify that. Those are words that people used in an email to me. And I definitely think we agree with the superintendent. I mean, the chairman. We do need to let parents know what potentially, what could happen if they choose to do this, because it's state law. We're not coming up with this idea of FSA and standardized testing. It's just there. So I just wanted to clarify that I just wanted to point that out. It was just for going forward. And I think we need to do, maybe not necessarily just a Connect Orange call, but we need to do something to get the word out to our families so that they understand what potential ramifications for their children are. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else have anything on this topic? Okay. I don't have anybody else queued up. I'm going to shift gears completely. And Dr. Jenkins, I don't expect an answer to these two questions tonight. I gave you forewarning about a month ago, but we got so busy with other issues that I didn't ask them at the last meeting. I had a constituent bring two issues to my attention